A quiet transformation happens inside empaths that most people never notice at first. It does not happen overnight. It happens slowly through emotional exhaustion, betrayal, overstimulation, and years of carrying emotions that were never truly theirs to carry. In the beginning, empaths usually feel deeply connected to people. They listen more than others. They care more than others. They forgive faster than others. But over time, life begins to reshape them in ways even they do not fully understand. The smiling person who once gave endless emotional energy suddenly becomes distant. The person who used to comfort everyone starts disappearing into silence. And the most painful part is that many empaths do not even realize these changes are happening until they no longer recognize themselves emotionally. There are actually 3 emotional phases that many empaths experience during life, and each phase changes the way they see people, relationships, trust, and even themselves. The second phase is often the hardest because it is the stage where emotional burnout quietly takes over. This is where many empaths stop feeling emotionally safe around others. It is where they begin withdrawing from conversations, avoiding crowds, protecting their energy, and questioning almost every connection around them. Psychology studies on emotional sensitivity and compassion fatigue have shown that highly empathetic people often absorb stress from their environments more intensely than average individuals. Over time, this can overload the nervous system and create emotional exhaustion that looks very similar to anxiety, isolation, or emotional numbness. But most people misunderstand this phase completely. They assume the empath became cold, dramatic, antisocial, or emotionally unstable, when in reality the empath is often struggling with deep internal exhaustion after years of emotional overgiving. And strangely, this painful phase is also where many empaths begin their emotional awakening. It is the point where they slowly stop sacrificing themselves for everyone else. In this video, you will learn the 3 emotional life phases most empaths go through, why phase 2 changes people forever, how emotional burnout silently transforms personality, and why mature empaths eventually become more selective, quieter, and emotionally guarded. You will also understand why some of the kindest people suddenly disappear emotionally after years of constantly being available for others. Some of these psychological patterns are rarely talked about openly, especially the connection between empathy, emotional survival, and nervous system overload. By the end of this video, many things about your own emotional patterns may finally start making sense. And if parts of this video feel deeply personal, there is probably a reason for that. Welcome to Psychology of Power, where we explore the hidden psychology of human behavior, emotional intelligence, empathy, and personal transformation. Subscribe to the channel and join us for more deep psychological insights that help you understand both yourself and the people around you on a much deeper level. The first phase usually begins very quietly. Most empaths do not even realize they are different from other people at this stage. They simply move through life feeling everything more deeply than the people around them. They notice emotional tension quickly. They can sense sadness behind fake smiles. They pay attention to changes in tone, energy, silence, and emotional behavior without even trying. And because of this emotional sensitivity, they naturally become the person others lean on. Friends vent to them. Family members depend on them emotionally. Strangers open up to them unusually fast. People feel understood around them because empaths often create emotional safety without effort. In the beginning, this feels meaningful to them. It gives them purpose. They feel needed. They feel valuable when they help others emotionally. So they begin giving more and more of themselves away without realizing how dangerous that pattern can become over time. They listen for hours even when they are mentally exhausted. They forgive people who repeatedly hurt them because they always try to understand the pain behind the behavior. They make excuses for toxic actions because they focus too much on potential instead of reality. They become emotional caretakers in relationships without anyone asking them to. Slowly, their entire identity becomes connected to helping, fixing, understanding, calming, and emotionally supporting other people. And the difficult part is that many empaths genuinely believe this is what love is supposed to look like. During this phase, empaths often struggle with saying no because guilt follows them everywhere. Even small boundaries can make them feel selfish. They overthink simple decisions because they constantly worry about hurting other people emotionally. They apologize too much. They explain themselves too much. They feel responsible for emotions that were never theirs to carry. If someone around them becomes upset, they immediately search for ways to fix it internally. Even when conflict has nothing to do with them, they absorb the emotional atmosphere as if it belongs to them personally. This creates a dangerous emotional habit where the empath slowly disconnects from their own needs while becoming hyper-focused on everyone else's emotional state. Many empaths were raised in environments where emotional approval felt conditional. Love may have been connected to performance, emotional caregiving, people-pleasing, or avoiding conflict. Because of this, they unconsciously learn that their value comes from how much comfort they provide to others. They become emotionally hyper-aware because their nervous system adapts to constantly monitoring emotional environments. This is why many empaths can detect tension so quickly. Their brain and body learned early that emotional awareness was connected to safety and acceptance. As this phase continues, empaths begin staying in emotionally unhealthy relationships far longer than they should. They believe patience can heal emotionally unavailable people. They believe kindness can soften manipulation. They believe enough understanding can eventually create change inside someone who repeatedly causes emotional harm. They become trapped in cycles where they constantly give emotional energy while receiving very little in return. And because they are naturally compassionate, they often ignore clear warning signs. They notice the red flags, but they emotionally explain them away. They tell themselves the other person is struggling, misunderstood, damaged, stressed, or emotionally wounded. Instead of protecting themselves, they try harder. They give more time, more energy, more forgiveness, more understanding, more emotional labor. Meanwhile, their own emotional exhaustion quietly grows beneath the surface. One of the least understood things about empaths is that many of them are not trying to save others because they are weak. In many cases, they are trying to create the emotional safety they never fully received themselves. Helping others becomes emotionally addictive because it gives them temporary meaning and connection. But this creates a pattern where they tolerate emotional imbalance far too long. They become the therapist in friendships, the emotional stabilizer in relationships, the listener in every conversation, the person who absorbs stress while everyone else releases theirs. Over time, this slowly drains their nervous system in ways they do not recognize immediately. Emotional exhaustion rarely arrives all at once. It builds silently through repeated emotional overexposure. The empath keeps showing up for people while privately feeling more exhausted after every interaction. But because they are used to prioritizing others emotionally, they ignore the warning signs inside themselves. Eventually, the empath begins noticing strange emotional changes they cannot fully explain. They still care deeply, but emotional interactions begin feeling heavier than before. Conversations that once energized them now drain them. Certain people leave them mentally exhausted for hours or even days afterward. They begin needing more time alone to recover emotionally. Their tolerance for emotional chaos decreases. Their patience weakens. The same person who once answered every message immediately now delays responses because even small social interactions feel mentally overwhelming. But during this stage, many empaths feel guilty for changing. They think something is wrong with them. They wonder why they suddenly feel emotionally tired around people they once cared deeply about. What they do not realize is that this is often the beginning of emotional burnout. The second phase usually begins after repeated emotional disappointment, betrayal, manipulation, or long-term emotional overgiving. It is not always caused by one dramatic event. Sometimes it develops after years of constantly carrying emotional weight for everyone else. The empath slowly reaches a point where their emotional system becomes overloaded. Their mind feels exhausted, their nervous system remains constantly alert. They begin expecting emotional pain before it even happens because their body has adapted to prolonged emotional stress. Psychology often refers to this as hypervigilance. After enough emotional betrayal or exhaustion, the brain begins scanning constantly for signs of future emotional danger. The empath becomes more cautious, more observant, and more emotionally guarded without consciously deciding to. This is the phase where many empaths begin disappearing emotionally, not because they stopped caring, but because they can no longer survive emotionally the way they used to. Their silence increases, their social energy decreases. They start withdrawing from emotionally draining people without explaining why. They stop over-explaining themselves because they become too exhausted to constantly justify their emotions. One of the biggest changes during this phase is emotional numbness. The empath who once felt everything intensely suddenly struggles to feel connected at all. This confuses them deeply because sensitivity used to define their identity, but emotional numbness is often the nervous system's way of protecting itself after prolonged emotional overload. When the mind experiences too much emotional stress without enough recovery, it sometimes reduces emotional responsiveness as a survival mechanism. During this phase, many empaths isolate themselves more than ever before. They avoid crowds, they ignore calls, they spend more time alone. Even normal conversations can feel overstimulating. Loud environments become emotionally exhausting. Small talk feels unbearable. The empath begins craving silence because silence feels emotionally safer than constant emotional exposure. Some people around them may misunderstand this completely. Friends may accuse them of changing. Family members may call them distant. Others may think they became arrogant, cold, selfish, or emotionally unavailable. But internally, the empath is usually fighting emotional exhaustion that most people cannot see. They are trying to recover from years of emotional overextension while still carrying guilt for needing space. One painful reality of phase 2 is that empaths often begin losing trust in people slowly and quietly. Not because they hate people, but because repeated emotional disappointment changes the way they experience connection. They begin noticing how often their kindness was taken for granted. They remember the times they were emotionally available for everyone else while nobody noticed their own emotional pain. They begin realizing how many relationships were emotionally one-sided. This awareness hurts deeply because empaths naturally want genuine emotional connection. Part of them still longs for closeness, understanding, and emotional intimacy. But another part fears becoming emotionally drained again. This creates an internal conflict where they crave connection while simultaneously withdrawing from it. Their nervous system also changes during this phase. Many empaths become extremely sensitive to emotional energy after burnout. They can feel emotionally overwhelmed quickly around negativity, manipulation, dishonesty, emotional instability, or constant emotional demands. Even being around emotionally chaotic people for short periods can leave them mentally exhausted afterward. This is why many empaths suddenly become more selective about who they spend time with. It is not because they think they are better than others. It is because their emotional system can no longer tolerate constant emotional overload without consequences. Compassion fatigue also becomes very common during this phase. Compassion fatigue happens when someone spends so much time emotionally caring for others that they eventually become emotionally depleted themselves. It is often discussed in psychology among therapists, caregivers, nurses, and emotionally supportive personalities. Empaths experience this deeply because they naturally absorb emotional stress from the people around them. At first, they may continue trying to help others despite their exhaustion, but eventually they reach a breaking point where even empathy itself begins feeling heavy. This creates intense confusion inside them because helping people used to feel meaningful, now it feels exhausting. One of the saddest parts of phase 2 is how invisible it often is. Many empaths continue functioning normally on the outside while internally feeling emotionally disconnected from everything around them. They still go to work, they still smile sometimes, they still respond occasionally. But internally they feel emotionally tired in ways words cannot fully explain. Their emotional energy becomes limited. Their patience shortens. They become quieter because they no longer have the emotional strength to constantly carry conversations, emotional tension, or other people's unresolved pain. They begin protecting their energy instinctively. This is also the phase where empaths stop chasing people. In phase 1, they often over-pursued relationships emotionally. They over-explained. They tried to fix misunderstandings immediately. They fought hard to maintain emotional closeness, but phase 2 changes this behavior dramatically. After enough emotional exhaustion, they stop forcing connections that no longer feel safe or mutual. They begin letting people leave without chasing after them. They stop begging to be understood. They stop emotionally performing for acceptance. And although this may look cold from the outside, it is often the beginning of emotional self-protection. Many empaths also become deeply reflective during this period. Isolation forces them inward. They begin analyzing their patterns, relationships, emotional wounds, and boundaries more honestly than before. They start recognizing how often they ignored their intuition just to maintain emotional harmony. They realize how much emotional pain they tolerated because they feared disappointing others. They begin understanding that empathy without boundaries can become self-destructive. This realization changes them permanently. Strangely, phase 2 is often where the empath finally starts waking up emotionally. The breakdown becomes the beginning of transformation. The emotional exhaustion forces them to confront painful truths they previously avoided. They realize not everyone deserves unlimited emotional access to them. They realize kindness without boundaries attracts emotional imbalance. They realize constantly saving others while abandoning themselves is not love. It is self-neglect disguised as compassion. Slowly, phase 3 begins emerging from the emotional wreckage of phase 2. This phase feels different emotionally because the empath no longer moves through life with the same emotional innocence. They still care deeply, but their empathy becomes wiser instead of limitless. One of the first major changes during this phase is that they stop chasing validation. In the past, approval from others often affected them deeply. They wanted to feel needed, appreciated, understood, and emotionally accepted. But after emotional burnout, they begin finding peace in emotional independence instead. They stop needing everyone to understand them. They stop explaining their boundaries constantly. They stop sacrificing their mental health just to maintain emotional harmony with people who consistently drain them. During this awakening phase, solitude begins feeling peaceful instead of lonely. Earlier in life, many empaths feared isolation because they associated connection with emotional security. But now they begin valuing emotional peace more than forced connection. Silence becomes healing. Distance becomes necessary. They learn that protecting their energy is not selfish. It is survival. This shift changes their relationships dramatically. They become more selective about who they allow close emotionally. They pay attention to consistency instead of words. They notice manipulation faster. They trust actions more than emotional promises. Another major transformation during this phase is emotional boundaries. Earlier in life, boundaries often felt cruel or uncomfortable to them. They feared hurting people by saying no. But now they understand that boundaries are necessary for emotional health. They stop overgiving automatically. They stop feeling responsible for fixing everyone's emotional problems. They begin asking themselves an important question they rarely asked before. What does this relationship cost me emotionally? That single awareness changes everything. The empath also becomes calmer during this phase, not because they feel less deeply, but because they stop reacting impulsively to every emotional situation around them. They become more observant. They listen carefully before trusting people. They no longer reveal everything about themselves immediately. They recognize that emotional access should be earned slowly, not given freely to everyone. This makes them harder to manipulate because they finally learn how to separate compassion from self-sacrifice. Emotionally mature empaths often appear quieter than before, but there is strength inside that silence. They no longer waste energy trying to convince emotionally unavailable people to care. They stop trying to rescue people who refuse accountability. They understand that empathy cannot heal someone who enjoys causing emotional harm. This realization protects them from repeating destructive emotional cycles. Their nervous system also begins stabilizing during this phase because they finally stop exposing themselves constantly to emotional chaos. They choose environments carefully. They distance themselves from manipulative behavior faster. They prioritize emotional peace over emotional intensity. This creates a deeper emotional balance that many empaths never thought was possible during phase 2. One powerful change during the awakening phase is self-respect. Earlier in life, many empaths valued other people's emotions more than their own, but now they begin recognizing their own emotional needs as equally important. They stop abandoning themselves to maintain unhealthy relationships. They stop confusing suffering with love. They stop believing endless patience automatically makes relationships meaningful. Instead, they begin valuing reciprocity, emotional safety, honesty, and consistency. The empath still feels deeply during this phase. That part never disappears. They still notice pain in others. They still care intensely. They still understand emotions most people overlook. But now their empathy includes themselves too. And that changes everything about the way they move through life. So no, empaths do not suddenly become distant for no reason. Most of the time, life slowly teaches them emotional survival. After years of carrying emotions that were never theirs, after constantly giving chances, understanding pain, forgiving betrayal, and sacrificing their own peace to protect others, something inside them finally changes, especially after phase 2. That phase leaves marks most people never fully see. It changes the way empaths trust, the way they connect, the way they protect their energy. And sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones who have survived the deepest emotional exhaustion. People often assume empaths become cold when they pull away, but many times they are simply learning how to stop drowning in everyone else's emotions. They are learning that constantly saving others should not require destroying themselves in the process. And that realization becomes one of the biggest emotional turning points of their entire life. Because mature empaths eventually understand that empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. They realize peace is more valuable than constant emotional chaos. They realize not everyone deserves unlimited access to their heart. And perhaps the hardest lesson of all, they finally understand that protecting their energy is not selfish. It is necessary. The strongest empaths are not the ones who feel the most. They are the ones who finally learn not to lose themselves while caring for others. If this video felt deeply personal, you are probably in one of these phases right now. And you are not alone in that experience. Many emotionally sensitive people silently go through these changes without anyone around them fully understanding what they are carrying internally. If you connected with this video, take a moment to subscribe to the channel for more deep psychological insights about empathy, human behavior, emotional healing, and the hidden patterns behind human emotions. Like this video if parts of it reflected your own journey, and share it with someone who may be emotionally exhausted in silence and needs to hear this. Also comment below which phase changed you the most, because your story may help someone else finally feel understood.